we're going to be taking a look over UV mapping tools in Maya. To access the UV mapping editor, you go into UV and then UV editor, and you'll see the window pop up. Usually better if you have two screens so that you can UV map in one window and have Maya open with your model in the other. You'll see this UV toolkit that pops open with the UV editor. Dragging the UV toolkit into the right hand side of the editor will allow you to dock it, and then you'll have all those UV controls within the one window. So in UV mapping, what we're doing is taking a three-dimensional object. So as you may have just seen, Maya crashed on me. This is a good time when you've finished modeling and you're going to go and unwrap everything to start deleting all of the history of these inputs. On the right hand side you can see in the channel box that are attached to all of these shapes. So it's removing all the bevels, tweaks, extrusions and deletions that we've gone through so far. So there's a lot of history here. We want to delete it all by grabbing our models in object mode and going to edit, delete all by type and history, and all that history will go away, and all we'll be left with when we click on our objects are the pure geometry data. This will help to prevent Maya from crashing while we're UV unwrapping. So UV unwrapping is simply taking a three-dimensional object like this rock and putting it onto a flat surface, essentially unwrapping it like you would if you unfolded a cardboard box. And this allows us to paint textures over the 2D surface. So importantly, in our UV editor here, you see what we're working with is a grid coordinate system with U along the bottom axis and V along the top axis here. So U is like the x-axis, V is like the y-axis. So we're mapping three-dimensional positions, vertices, onto this two-dimensional UV graph. What's really important here is that we keep everything within this 0 to 1 square. We can use all of these squares around here to do some working out, so consider that just your working out space, and then we're going to try and fit everything into this 0 to 1 square in the end. I'm going to go over some basic controls and some workflow tips when UV unwrapping your objects. So let's take a look at this rock as it's the simplest object first. I've got this selected in object mode. It's automatically UV'd according to the object it started as, which was a cube. So whenever I create a cube, you see the cube is unwrapped exactly the same way this has been unwrapped. Now this isn't very helpful to us because I've distorted the cube a lot since, so we need to get a more accurate representation, a more accurate projection of how this should be unwrapped. To do that, we have a bunch of options. We can go into our UV menu and you have these projection options here: automatic, best plane, camera based, contour stretched, normal based, cylindrical, planar and spherical. These are all the different selections for unwrapping your model. Let's go ahead and do automatic. What Maya has tried to do for us here is look at this object from a number of angles, from the top, bottom, left, right, and the other two sides there, and has tried to unwrap it based on the faces that it sees from those camera angles. So it's guessed at where to put the seams to cut out, and it's guessed at the shapes that it's resulted from. And as you can see, it's not a very neat unwrap. These seams in white are the seams along which it has been cut, and they're not very efficient. So automatic can be good for some things, especially if you're in a hurry and you're using Substance Painter, but for us now, we want something that's a little more accurate and a little more efficient to paint over. We can try the other projections to see what we'll get out of it. You've got best plane there. You have to select a face and then hit enter, as it says there. Find the projection plane and press enter. Yeah, and it does a projection. That's just projecting down right through the model. So that's not very useful either because it's going to map the bottom the same as the top, and the sides aren't being properly UV'd. So that's not very useful to us. So we could go through all these selections and find that none of them are going to effectively unwrap our model, and so we're going to look at other ways of doing it by hand. You have shortcuts for unwrapping here as well. So I'm just going to automatically unwrap this a second to discuss the anatomy of a UV unwrap. These parts that the UV map has been cut into are called UV shells. If you hold right click, you'll see UV shell is a selection option. You'll see this highlight on your UV toolkit as well on the right hand side here. So you've got your vertice, edge, face and your UV selection, as well as this tool for selecting the UV vertices, the individual little vertice points. So UV shell selection is really handy because we can select any of these shells or islands and we can move them around without needing to select faces on the model. So they can be great for quick selecting faces here. So from the main options here, we can also go into UV and UV shell and then select our faces by the shells that have been cut out. And the normal tools of W for move, E for rotate, and R for scale will apply here, as well as Q, your selection tool. On the right hand side, the UV toolkit offers us a lot of options for transforming the parts of the shell. you can see here if I have my W, E or R tool selected, I can shift the pivot to the top left of this shell, or to the bottom right or the center, or wherever you want it very quickly with a transform component. You can also move it using this little controller here, and that's moving it about the grid. There are snap rotation tools here where you can rotate by 90 degrees, or you can predefine another value in here. There's also step snap on scale, where we can press this button and we can scale it up by a factor of 2, or you could say scale it down by a factor of 0.5. So you can scale accurately with that. You can flip it left and right. On the U axis, that's left and right, and on the V axis would be up and down. And you have more options here for cutting and sewing your seams, for stitching things together, and unfolding your shell in a more optimized way. You see there's optimize the shell shape. So these tools are to help you whenever you have your UVs cut as you want them. Right now we're going to look into cutting these UVs up so that they work better. So for this, I'm going to be using the UV menu and then the 3D cut and sew UV tool. So that's near the bottom of that UV menu. I'll select that, and you see that it automatically puts on this shaded display of the UV shells. These colors will help us to easily identify where our shells are on the model itself. So let's look at marking new UV borders. And we're going to mark those. First of all, we need to unmark these. So a way we can do that is by holding Ctrl and clicking on them. You can double click to deselect an entire edge lip, or if we want to do this really quickly, we can go up to UV and then camera based, and what that will do is project new UVs. You need to be in object mode for that. I'm going to right click, go to exit tool, select my move tool, object mode, and grab that. Okay, so UV and then camera based, and what that will do is just a camera based projection. It will clear all of our borders, so it's just one big shell that's overlapping. Okay, so that's all of our borders, old borders cleared. We're now going to go back to UV and the 3D cut and sew tool, or we could click on the left hand side here where our last used tool is. Now it says drag and control and drag to cut. So to cut out our edges, we need to right click, go into component, and then edge. Make sure we're in edge mode to cut out those edges. And I can double click here to mark an entire edge, or I can hold Control and I can paint over edges. Actually, I can just click. Yeah, I can just click. Control and drag over is going to deselect the edges again. Okay, so you can paint or you can double click to select whole edges. It's going to be quicker for me if I double click to select. See, it's also easy to make mistakes if you're trying to paint over it, so I find double clicking works the best. Always handy to have things named in your outliner as well, so that I can isolate the object I'm working on. I'm just going to hide the rest of these objects here. In exit tool, object mode, holding Control to select the other objects, and then Control H to hide them. Okay, so back to our object here. Again, to select that tool, I can do it on the left hand side, and I'm going to double click there. Okay, so that is one big shell on top, and then I'm going to hold Shift, double click, hold Shift, double click. That's adding a selection. Double click. There we go. Okay, now this band in the middle here isn't going to unwrap quite right, and I'll show you how in a wee second. I'm going to right click, go to component and UV shell, and I could either unwrap individual shells by hovering over it and pressing D, or I can drag to select all of my shells and then press D, and you see I'll get a nice neat unwrap of that object. Now the problem is with this edge here, I would need to put a cut in one side of it so that it unwraps like you would if you slit a Coke can down the side. Cylindrical objects or objects with an edge like this will need to be unwrapped about a point, otherwise it will try to wrap it as a kind of onion ring shape. So to do that, I'm going to go back into my tool, I'm going to right click, component, edge, and I'm going to double click this edge here, and now whenever I unwrap it's going to unwrap from this cut. So I'll right click, component, UV shell, I'm going to drag across all my UV shells and press D again, and you see it unwraps that as a strip right around because I've cut it down here. Now this unwrap is looking a lot neater than the one we had before already. One way to check if your unwrap has been successful is to turn on this little checkerboard symbol here on the top of your UV editor, and what that will allow you to see is whether or not the UVs are relatively even across the surface. And we can see that these look like squares, and that is a good sign. If the squares are very badly distorted, you can see some distortion going on here. That's mainly because of bad geometry with what's called non-lamina faces, where these polygons are not perfectly flat. But all in all, the squares look to be relatively well proportioned. I'll show you what it would look like if they weren't. I'm just going to deselect this tool by selecting my select tool with Q and then going into UV. You'll see if I turn this checkerboard back on and then use R, my scale tool, and start moving this, you'll see it stretches it into rectangles, and that's what you want to avoid. You want to make sure that they stay square so that you have an even distribution of your map. Otherwise, when you go to draw on this surface, whenever you draw a line, or say you drew a circle, it's going to elongate it into an oval. So squares is one thing you're looking for. Another thing you're looking for is for these squares to be the same size across the entire shape. So you can see this edge here hasn't unwrapped as well as I would hope. It's quite stretched, the little squares on this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate it round. And there are some tools that may help me do this. I can do it myself by pressing the R tool and trying to scale this so that those become square. So that's looking a lot better. And then I want to make sure that my squares are the same size the whole way across my object. That's called maintaining Texel density. That's the density of these squares here, that everything is even. So to do that, I could grab the middle of my scale tool and I could scale it up until the squares are all the same sort of size. And then you'll see this is not fitting into my map anymore. So what I would need to do is drag around all three of those, and I would need to scale them all down together so that they fit in. Okay. So even though that's going to mean these sides aren't as big as they could possibly be, this is a much more even unwrap, and the texture will look a lot better on this because you want the same resolution of texture across the entire surface. So try and get these squares to even out as well as possible. Now for all of the bent squares and things like that, and what I could have done with the strip as well, and I'll just go back to illustrate it, is use some of the pre-made tools here, like the Unfold and the Optimize tools in my UV toolkit. So I'm going to hit Optimize, I'm going to hit Unfold, and I don't get any good results there. What I can do with this is click my Optimize tool, and I can change the size of the brush on that by holding B and my middle mouse button and clicking and dragging with that middle mouse. I can change the brush size, and I can paint over that to try and optimize it. I can also use the Unfold tool and paint over to try and unfold it a little more, and you see it starts changing the UV map. Now that hasn't worked very well, so I'm going to go back to that unwrap that I did myself. So I have this object unwrapped. What I don't want is this object to be in a different UV space. Everything's going to need to be in this 0 to 1 space here, so I can move that in. But for now, I'm going to use the working out spaces here, and I'm just going to drag all of these shells into the right hand side, and I can deal with them later. I know that that's all the stone UVs done. And actually, just before I leave the UVs of this rock, I can right click and go into edge mode, or I could go into UV mode and select the little UV vertices here and check where the front of my rock is. So I see the front of the rock is here, and then the front of the underside of the rock is there. So what I would want to do is maybe point those both in the same direction for whenever I'm texturing. So I'm going to grab my UV shell and I'm going to rotate that and move it into a better space. I'm going to rotate this one so that they're both facing upwards. Just if I'm putting stone grain on and I'm hand painting it, that'll be a much handier way to do it. So I'll pop them there, that's sitting there nice and neat, ready to put into my main texture map. So I can minimize my UV window. I'm going to return to my outliner, and I'm going to look at the next object. Let's go for this cylindrical one, the pillar. Shift H to show that, and I'm just going to Control H to hide my rock. Now, just as I'm moving on to this, one important point to note is I have a bunch of objects here that I'm going to be creating. You'll see from my reference that I have 3 of these claws, I have 3 of these pillars, and I have several of these stones. Now, a very important workflow tip: if I duplicated, say, this pillar before I UV unwrapped it, what I would need to do is unwrap each one of the duplicate pillars individually. So you're creating 3 times as much work for each other. Anywhere where you have duplicate geometry, keep 1 copy only. UV unwrap this object, like I've UV unwrapped this rock, and then all these other rocks, which are going to be duplicates of this, wait until the UVs are in their final place they're going to be in before you go about duplicating them and placing them all around your scene. So the UVs that we've just done will be copied with the geometry. So make sure you UV unwrap your object first of all, then duplicate, and you'll be saving yourself a whole lot of work. So we can close that outliner for the moment, and I'm going to reopen that UV window. So let's take a look at, sometimes you'll accidentally dock your UV editor. You can just drag the little tab and open it in its own tab again, and then resize the window. things that are going to happen by accident. And then you see if your workspace gets reset like this, you can also always just go back here and go to reset current workspace in the top right hand side. If you want to minimize a window like I do with my UV toolkit here, just click the little tab and it will put that into the side docked. Now as you can see, this object was started from a cylinder, so I have the simple cylinder unwrap here. If I go and select my object in object mode, UV and automatic, I will get an automatic projection which looks okay, but really messy. I could certainly do better myself using the UV and 3D cut and sew UV tool. So I'm going to do that now. Again, I'm going to clear my UVs by going to camera based, and then I'm going to go about creating my own UVs with this tool by clicking and double clicking and holding Ctrl and click to deselect edges. So I'm just going to mark all the edges I want to cut along. Now you can see here what I've been going for with a cylindrical object. If I hadn't put this cut up the middle, it wouldn't have unwrapped very well. It would have unwrapped everything in strange compressed rings. So you need to have that cut line. And what I've done is I've placed the cut line up underneath this peak and down the center in a place that I feel is going to be best hidden, because the viewer is more than likely going to be seeing it from this kind of an angle, facing down in towards the well. So I think that's a good hidden place. As a general rule, try and put your UV seams in a place that you're not going to easily see. So not on the top surface or the surface that will be facing the player or the viewer. So I've tried to do that here. Let's take a look at some of the biggest shells, like this part here. You can see it is unwrapped with a wave, just whatever way it has optimized that. What we can do is we can use these tools to try and optimize and try and unfold it a bit better and things. But what I'm actually going to do here is I've used my rotate tool just to line it up with my grid a wee bit, and then I'm going to use this straighten UVs command, and you'll see that straightens that right out. Sometimes this will do more harm than good, and certainly if I use it on an object that's rotated too far like this, if I press straighten UVs, you'll get some strange results. So I would advise first trying to align it with the grid as well as possible, and then sometimes the straighten UV button will work really well for giving you nice orderly UVs to your shapes. Always watch that this doesn't cause the UV borders, the edges, to overlap each other. And while we're on the topic of overlapping, it's fine the way these are at the moment overlapping as we unwrap them and get them set up in a way that we know what each part is. But in the end, we want no UVs at all to overlap. In fact, there should be what's called a padding or a space. If I move this shell here down near this one, I don't want this to be crammed right next to this shell here. I want to leave a little bit of padding so that any textures do not bleed over, any colors don't bleed between the two. So don't overlap your UVs like this. Make sure everything has its own space and leave a little bit of padding so that there's no texture bleed. Now I'm going to go ahead and UV unwrap the rest of my objects. So that's all the UVs unwrapped. Let's take a look in Windows and Outliner, and I'm going to show all of these objects again just by pressing Shift and H. Okay, and each one of these objects we can see when they're all selected. I'll just select this. There we go. We have the pillar here on the left. We have the main base in the center. We have the rock on the right, the claw on the bottom, and then on the top is the well. Okay, so all of these need to go within the 0 to 1 boundary here. So here's a few tips. When arranging your UVs, say we wanted all of these objects to share one texture map, so we're going to be painting them individually, but they'll all be on the one map. What we want to do is click into the checker map. And we talked about Texel density before, so that will be shown by how big these squares of the UV grid are on the surface of our objects. So the smaller that the squares are, the higher the Texel density, which means the higher resolution the texture will appear. So these big squares will be low res texture. It will look more pixelated. These small squares will look sharper because there's a greater density of pixels will be devoted to that space. Ideally, what you want to do in games is get everything at the same scale. So I would have to say if I wanted this rock to be in the same scale as my base here, I would right click, go to UV shell, select my rock, Actually, what will make this a lot easier, because as I select new objects, the shells will disappear. I'm going to combine all these objects just for now. Okay, and then they'll always show the other UVs. So I'm going to go into UV shell. I'm going to select this rock, and I can see that the squares are a lot smaller in it. So I'm going to use my R scale tool to scale this down until the squares become about the same size as they are on my base. Okay, and that's how I know that I have them at the same texel density to the base. So I'll go and do that with the rest of my objects here. So you can see, looking around our texture map here, we've not done too bad a job of matching up the texel density of each of these items so that they're roughly the same size of squares right across the board, and that has allowed us to fit all of our objects onto the one texture map. What I could do alternatively is maybe save the base out as one texture, and then I could reorganize all of these objects onto another texture sheet and just have a texture sheet object and another one, a separate texture for the base, and then say I could make the base texture maybe 4K or 8K in size, and I could make these other textures 2 to 4K. So one last tool to look at is on the top left hand side of our UV editor. You'll see these little shading options for wireframe, for shading in your shells, and then this final one will show us any areas of distortion or stretch. It's called the UV distortion tool. Okay, so anything that's colored red will be stretched UVs, anything colored blue has been compressed. Okay, so blue stuff doesn't have enough space, red stuff is stretched. And you can see here from this, it's not too extreme anywhere on my object. If I was to grab an object shell and properly stretch it, you would see that that highlights most of it in red. Now, if these errors look really bad to you, you could go in with some of the tools in your UV toolkit to fix them. The Optimise and Unfold options and Optimise and Unfold tools will be handy. Again, you press B and middle mouse to drag the brush size bigger or smaller, and you can use those tools to help re-optimize the shapes so that they may work a little better. Optimize tool, and you see there I can kind of like smooth over those shapes so that they're a little more highly optimized for texturing. Another thing I'm looking out for here with the texel density is things like this hand, which I quite like, this claw, will be a focal point or one of the focal points, and they also glow, while these rocks won't really be focused on. Now the rocks have a slightly higher texel density than the hand, so what I might want to do here is just get these rocks and move them into this space here and maybe make them a little smaller so that they fit into that space. And then I'm going to grab the hand, take the rock out of the way, grab those hand UVs, move it into this space, shimmy over the pillar, and that'll give me plenty of space to just boost the size of this claw here and make the most of what is going to be a fairly significant part of the model. So you can work out the fine-tuning of these things. You can see as well I have ordered, I've making a specific order to the different assets. So for instance, on this orb, the top of the orb is up above the bottom of the orb in the order in my map. Also have the post here, gradients up from the bottom gradually to the top through the way I've laid out the shell, so I know exactly when I'm painting. Say I want a gradient of dirt from the bottom rising up, and I'm hand painting this myself. I can start the dirt here and then make it tail off towards here, and I'll be able to do those gradients accurately because of the way I have my UVs laid out. So you'll pick this stuff up in time. Now we're going to want to export these UVs for texturing, but just before that, remember that we have objects here that we may want to duplicate. So to do that, I need to separate these this geometry again. I'm going to do that by clicking on this button here, the extract button, and that will extract these into separate models again. And then I have to duplicate this and this model here and spread them around the scene, as well as some of these rocks. Because I have UV'd them, the UVs will appear in exactly the same place for all the objects that I duplicate now. So Ctrl and D will duplicate, and then you'll be able to select them in the outliner as separate objects, and we can move them around the scene. Windows, outliner, you'll see this object here, which is it's now called the well one, just because of the way the naming convention has gone. If I Ctrl and D, I will get a new copy of that here, and you'll actually see that maybe nested under, yeah, they're all nested within this well-one selection. So what I'm actually going to do here is combine these objects together, because I want to duplicate all of them. And then I can move the center point by pressing D, and I'm going to snap the center point onto the center of my grid just by holding X, grabbing the center, putting it into the center of my grid there. And then I can use the E tool to rotate those round into position. So I'm going to press Ctrl D to duplicate, and then I can spin those round into position. And a third of the way around my model is going to be 120 degrees. So I'll type that into rotate Y, and then I'm going to duplicate this object. I'm going to begin rotating that, and then you see on my rotate Y, I'm going to type in the next one will be 240 degrees around a 360 degree axis, and there we have our duplication done for those objects. Next it's just the rocks. So that's the scene finished. You can see that these UVs are essentially overlapping for these objects. They're in exactly the same space. And you can see that if I go to move these ones out of the way, and then I select another one, you'll see that they're in different places. So I don't want that right now. I want them to be in the same space. Now, if we're hand painting them like I am, and you're only painting an albedo texture, a color texture, that is fine to have overlapping UVs that are identical. However, it's not ideal really for any other type of texturing. So if you're texturing up realistic texture, you want to use different lighting and shading data and normal maps, things like ambient occlusion that will overlap on these objects if they're clipping differently. So for instance, the stones here clip differently through the ground. If I used ambient occlusion maps on them, you would see the little marks where other stones are clipping through at different angles. So generally a bad idea to have all of this overlapping UVs, but since we're just painting an albedo texture for this hand painted look, this will work absolutely fine. So let's look at exporting this UV map then. I want to drag around everything in my scene in object mode. Since I'm going to be exporting everything at once, I'm just going to tidy up my scene here by hiding my references. So I've got all of my objects here, going to combine them using this little combine tool here. Okay, so this is all one, it'll all be moved as one, or scaled as one. You see Maya is actually highlighting that the rocks and the other objects are overlapping, but we're fine with that for now. And then to export these, I can either click on this little camera icon, the UV snapshot tool, or I can go to Image and UV snapshot. And there I'll get some options. What I want to do is browse for a place to put these. It's automatically putting it in my project folder I created in the Out UV, so I'm happy with that. You can change that with browse. Image format, always going to be PNG for me because it has transparency. You can change the size of the texture. I want mine to be quite big because I've got a lot in there. If I use the bigger the texture I use, the better the resolution that I'll get. So what I want to go to is 4098 by 4098, which is 4K. Sorry, 4096 by 4096. The usual sizes for textures go up in doubles, so it would be 256 by 256, then 512 by 512, then 1024 by 1024. That would be 1K, you call that, because it's 1000 pixels just over it. Then 2048 by 2048 is 2K, and then 4096 by 4096 is 4K. And you're also getting into 8K textures now as well. The edge color, my background in Photoshop is white, so I don't want my edge color to be white. I'm going to pull that down to be black. And in fact, for the purpose of painting over it, I have no red in my scene really. So I'm actually going to make these UVs be bright red. Then I'm going to click apply, and that should save out into the area that you have specified up here. So let's take a look at that. And you can see that I have an out UV here that I'm just going to rename diorama UV. Right click and open in Photoshop, and I'm just going to rename the first layer here UV map. Now, it's hard to see the lines whenever my background is transparent, so I'm going to create a new layer, drag it underneath. I'm going to call that background, and I'm going to color that with the paint bucket tool here a mid-gray color. Always better to work on mid-gray than it is white or black. And there you see I can see my red lines quite clearly. If you do want your lines to show up more clearly, you can always duplicate this layer a couple of times, and you see the lines will get darker, and then you can grab all those layers and combine them, and that will just allow your lines to shine through a little clearer. You're now ready to import and lock down your reference layer, which you can hide and show as you need it. And you'll be able to create a paint layer and then color pick from this reference layer using your Alt tool or I, the color picker, and you can start to paint up the different areas of your texture map. And that's it for UV unwrapping in Maya.